record to this. Good morning, Alicia. Alicia Grullón is a friend, is a colleague, is somebody with whom I have worked for a long time at events and festivals like Art in Art Places. We have shown at venues like the 8th floor. Where else have we shown Alicia? And Alicia lives in the Bronx. You were born in the Bronx too, is that correct?
I was born in Washington Heights, like every good Dominican you are.
And now you are in the Bronx.
Yes.
But you've lived there, like, yeah, you're a Bronxite of some kind.
Oh yeah, no, totally.
Wow, I have so much to say about you. You are an activist, you are an artivist, you are a mother, you work with the ecology, you have done works on walking, and on and on. Why don't you continue to introduce yourself to our class? Welcome, we are here at UT, and this is a class on walking in Austin.
Okay. All right, friends. So I'm going to share my screen. Let me know if you can see it. Yeah, my participants. Okay, hi. Hi, everyone. Thanks very much, Nicolas, for all your warm words always. And it's always been a pleasure to work with you. I think Nicolas and I, in addition to the festivals that he mentioned, we also worked together in a program that he curated for el Museo del Barrio back in 5 minutes. And I think that was the moment where we spent the most time together talking and getting to know each other through our work, but also through the experience of being artists in New York City, and also, sharing our Dominican heritage, and being in el Museo del Barrio, whose foundation was focused on Uptown, on the community in East Harlem, which was fundamentally had a Puerto Rican foundation and has grown into a more amplified Latinx community, and the museum itself being founded by parents and art educators who wanted a space for the community that represented the community back in 1968. Okay, so I'm going to start, and happy you see my images. I'm not going to do a slideshow. It is a slideshow, friends, but I'm not going to go into slide mode. It'll be a little easier, and hopefully I'll get to play a short video of one of my pieces. And the work that I'll be sharing with you is not in chronological order, and we will walk through some of, I don't want to say highlights, but some of the pieces that resonated for me to share with you, to give you a background of my work. So yeah, I'm a 49-year-old single Latinx parent with 2 tweens, and I care for my elderly father, and I'm living in a settler colonial consumer-driven society. So according to these statistics, I was not meant to make art, nor create the freedom needed as an artist to live my life fully. In the art world, I sometimes get the feeling that my presence shatters what Dr. Kim Tallbear describes as the colonial standards of settler sex, family, and marriage with a patriarchal head. And I'm not romanticizing living precariously as an artist and an adjunct. Sometimes there is glamour. It's great going to openings. It's great seeing friends, shows. But there's no glamour in living precariously due to the structures of our society and the lack of recognition for what artists have to contribute to society, which in essence is to ask the more difficult questions and develop processes in which we can embark on the transformation that our world today is asking of us to do. And I'm grateful I'm so grateful for moments like these because I'm able to talk about what I've been working on for the last now 18 years, where at the time of my graduate studies, there was little room for discussing the intricacies of image making as a woman of color. And I put my body in situations that have historically not been meant for me or designed so I have little control over how I am represented in them. By which I mean my body as a signifier. So how do I read as I walk into a room when the signification of my body, woman of color, will vary based on who is doing the looking within the context of a settler plantation colonial patriarchal gaze? And some of these situations in my work have included the Revolutionary War, the United Nations, large cultural institutions, and universities, among others. And I encourage viewers to reflect upon my work as a storytelling process, bordering between the staged and the documented. I use performance art, participatory art, photography, and video towards critiques on the politics of presence that argue for the inclusion of divested communities in political and social spheres. In my work, let me go to the next slide. So in my work, I visually analyze the semiotic conditions existing under the circumstances I just described to you. Photography was a tool, first a colonial tool, driving narratives to dehumanize the colonized. And it came about at a perfect moment in history, right? The power of the image laid in science. And it was used to justify theories used by aristocrats, robber barons, and politicians, all influenced by the doctrine of discovery at a moment in the mid-19th century where Europe saw itself in a depression due to crumbling infrastructure and not upgraded since the Industrial Revolution and perpetual internal wars. So the realism of photography helped ignite and justify further colonization of Africa and Asia and the Western Hemisphere, mainly robbing the indigenous people of those lands of anything of wealth in order to promote an economy based on extraction and genocide.
Alicia, we can only see part of your images. There's something blocking them, like a gray bar. Yes.
Okay, hold on. Can you see it now?
Yes.
Okay, great. My screen is not that big, friends, so I'm trying to navigate my little screen. Hold on.
There.
Okay. So this is fine.
Yes.
What about now?
Yes.
Okay. All right. I'm going to move this here. Is that good? Okay. So I'm interested in visual patterns that I found through my research when I was in graduate school. Visual patterns in photography of the mid to late 19th century and 20th centuries and how image making was structured, how people have been visually othered. And this has been the basis of my embodied research. And what I'm interested in it is in how can I undo it? How can I undo how we take certain signs and symbols that we see in images to identify people when that identification isn't based on who those people are, but on information that has been cultivated for over a century and a half about who people are. And that's where the performance aspect comes into my work. And some of these patterns include perhaps associating people of color to nature, but not in a relational equal condition, but within the justification of a manifestation, a manifest destiny, or a doctrine of discovery, based on more biblical callings of superiority to tame and control nature and anyone who is not seen as human. And that definition of human, I'll quote Sylvia Wynter, is based on a human being in the body of well, exemplified in the body of a cis white man, heterosexual. And we see these in drawings and in paintings since the early 16th century, many drawn by men who had never visited, for example, the Western Hemisphere or the global South. And these images have formed the foundations of how we see one another and how we see the world. So all of this research became my first large series of work, and I'll show you a few images from that series called Becoming Myth, an autoethnographic study. And within that, I created an autoethnographic study of myself, of the history of myself, but the history of myself based on images, specifically traveling postcards, carte de visite, which were a type of photography that became very popular in the very late 19th century and early 20th century, where, you know, just as travelers' postcards, a lot of people were commissioned or went on their own with their own resources to places that had been colonized, and developed an archive of images depicting peoples from other places to those in settler colonial nations, those whose wealth had increased due to the process of colonization, through the process of extraction, that collection of wealth. And I see my work as history making, not as historization. So it's not an alternative to history. The narratives of people of color, the poor working class, and LGBTQ people have been relegated to the margins of social and cultural importance. Yet, as emplaced heterotopias, such as Foucault has written about, these heterotopias exist out of a response to repression. So these cultural circles emerge as a response to not being allowed in the larger, more dominant sphere. And my work is part of a living archive, a living history, actively undoing an imperial archive, physical and psychic, present within our seeing. And I use the self-portrait mostly. So in my work, I am the figure that you'll predominantly see, and I'm not doing it as me, Alicia, but really using my body and what I represent, who I represent. And I use the self-portrait so that my gaze is present as the I and I. And it disables what scholar Ariella Azoulay calls the political lexicon, promoting crime-free narratives. So my work is not disassociated. It is engaged with the viewer and history. And some of the artists that I've looked at over the years include Laura Aguilar, Adrian Piper, Ana Mendieta, Lorraine O'Grady, Anna DeVere Smith, and Martha Wilson. So these images here, I'm moving my cursor around, they're rather small, and I kept them in the tradition of many carte de visites, traveling postcards, and they're no more than 6 by 4 inches. And in them, I chose specific locations outside in nature where I was at the time, where I was living in New Paltz, New York, which is north of New York City, and it's a very rural area, and also locations within New York City. So drawing from these environments that I was living in and seeing how and if my identity and what I signified changed due to the environmental conditions that these photographs were taken under. So one of the patterns that I discovered in my research with traveling postcards was the selective use of either female, more scientific word, or woman. And I found that many times women of color were not described in whatever caption a photographer might have provided, which oftentimes they didn't. They were just called female, more in a scientific term. And more women who were more bourgeois or white and middle class, or upper middle class, a lot of the descriptions would describe them as a woman and doing something in some activity. You know, stressing the ideas of how we dress, of what we did as a marker of humanizing us. So this one here, it's women, a female with mule hip, and circa 2005 performance. That's the formal title of these images. This one is more woman with shrine. So other instances, even if a person was outside, if they were seen to be Christianized or a woman would be attributed to them, and their dress and formal dress would not be indicative of their cultural upbringing in regards to women of color or women in the global South, but more associated to their humanity being granted through their becoming Christian. And this is another one, woman in Riverdale. So the whole series contains 18 images, 18 cartes de visites, and all of them follow the same pattern. Circa 2005 as an element of marking the date, and performance, because they are ethnographic studies, but again, I like to border between this documented reality and more of theatrical reality, to start asking questions of what these images come to signify to the viewer. So that was the first part of my life, doing many self-portraits and returning to performance. I have a theater background, so my BFA was in theater, and I left that industry for many reasons, but primarily because last century when I graduated, there are very few roles offered to me that weren't extras, that were usually extras that were either maids or prostitutes or, you know, someone who's a drug addict. No major role, but again, using the signification of otherizing women of color within these ideas of what women of color did, and how that in mass media is used to cultivate a division between people. We stop seeing each other as human beings who, you know, we all cry the same way, we laugh the same way, but creating this fear. You all watch the evening news, so you know exactly what I mean. And through this process of performance, I started reenacting incidents in current history that we would probably often forget, because people often are left out in the writing of history. It's usually delegated to someone or a small group of people appointed to do the history, hopefully in an objective manner, but we all know that many aspects of history are left out, and those reasons vary. But in essence, it's the leaving out of parts of culture, of humanity, that leave a distorted way of how we move through spaces, how we make decisions, because there's a lot of information that is not made accessible. And one of these moments for me was the filibuster bill of 2013. There's some text on the screen. And that was Senator Wendy Davis's 11-hour filibuster at the time that was, as you may all know, the omnibus bill that was going to close all the women's healthcare clinics, and only allowing 5. And we all know Texas is huge. So that would pose a lot of issues for women and people seeking healthcare, mostly poor people seeking healthcare. And I was commissioned by BRIC House for an exhibition, Whisper or Shout. And in that commission, I proposed reenacting this 11-hour filibuster for audiences, and I reenacted it in 2016. And we did it word for word, script for script, tried to mimic aspects of the text, the Austin courthouse, or the Congress, as best we could in the stage we had. And in addition to the performance itself, the 11-hour performance, we also had images and paintings from the Texas Senate House. You know, many of these paintings depicting aspects of Texan history. In addition to this, parts of it were personal for me. My mother was subjected to forced sterilization 2 years after I was born. And one aspect of women's reproductive health and people's healthcare in general, these conversations, I think, are important to keep in the context of what occurred to mostly Indigenous and Black women in the US, forced sterilization, and also to poor white women, particularly those who exhibited some sort of disability, who were sterilized. And so in my view, this conversation of healthcare and redoing this filibuster, I had to include the presence of all these people who form a fundamental part of reproductive history in our country. And on the desk, I had some books of writers who I leaned on support and who had written extensively on these topics, on our bodies. And some of those books include Angela Davis's Women, Race, and Class, Bell Hook's Art on My Mind, Coco Fusco, These Bodies That Are Not Ours, and this bridge called My Back. And it was to draw attention to the politics of the body, and in regards to Black, Indigenous, and women of color. And as I just described, it's paying closer attention to this history of forced sterilization and slavery as a way to deepen our perspectives on reproductive rights for women and queer and trans folks. Surrounding these books were herbs and objects from predominantly global South and Fourth World regions, herbs that were specific to women's bodies to tend to them, to heal to them. And yeah, it was a long reenactment. I don't think I will restage this again anytime soon. It took a lot of work, and I can answer any questions on the technical aspects of that a little later when I'm finished, if you're curious. So after this episode of the reenactment, that was my first performative reenactment, filibuster one. I started again delving into my body and its place in history, and recalling parts of my childhood where I was very lucky to be surrounded by a more international group of people. My parents immigrated here in the very early 1960s due to fleeing a dictatorship, a very brutal one. Not that any dictatorship is not brutal, but a very brutal one, all the less. And the subsequent US invasion afterwards. So my parents met in New York City in this country, and my brother and I were born here. And due to language, we met people that were just not exclusive to the Dominican Republic. There are many people throughout the Western Hemisphere that my parents were friends with and who were part of my growing up. And I call this bit of my personal history in because it colored how I understood history. There may be, for example, one historical event that we all may be familiar with, but depending on where you're from, you'll have a different perspective of looking at that historical event due to whoever writes the history and whatever history is allowed to be popularized in the place you're from. And there were some commonalities, particularly when we spoke of colonial history. And at school, what I learned in school, parts of it were very different from what I was hearing at home and what I would hear in conversations between this more international population. So entering and asking questions in school was, you know, I faced a little pushback, and that memory of those interactions always stayed with me. So in 2017, I was part of another exhibition at a place called the Old Stone House. And if you ever visit New York, the Old Stone House is in Brooklyn. And it's one of the remaining Dutch colonial homes in New York City. And it was a great environment to do the work. And I was commissioned to do some portraits that we won't have time today. I could go out for hours, friend, but so I've selected some things. And these images, again, I was recalling the history that I have spoken to you about, and being in this Dutch colonial home, I started to think of the intersections of what had occurred in this Dutch colonial home within the context of the world. For me, everything occurs within the context of what is occurring in the world. We cannot divorce ourselves, in my opinion, from the context of what is happening, because we're part of the world. So going to the Dutch colonial home, I was very fascinated that this home existed at a time where there were about 150 years had passed of when in the Caribbean of its colonization. And, you know, then the rest of the Western Hemisphere was, after 1492, slowly being colonized as well. And I was fascinated by that moment. This house existed after 150 plus years of the Haiti, the now called the island of Hispaniola, being colonized. And at the same time, I had lived a year in the last century in the Netherlands. So I was fascinated by the fact that this old colonial Dutch home was built around 1630, whereabouts, you know, give or take 10 years. And I was just fascinated that that was also the time of the Dutch Golden Age. And the resources that were making these countries wealthy were due to the extraction and the genocide occurring in other parts of the world. So these intersections, these moments in history really were fascinating to me when I was developing these other portraits that I won't be sharing. But they're on my website. And at that moment, I was informed by the director of the Old Stone House that there was an annual reenactment that happens in Brooklyn every year of the Battle of Brooklyn. And it was one of the few battles of the Revolutionary War fought in New York City, of which the settler colonialists lost. The US, we lost that battle for many reasons. Among them, it was like an open call for those to fight in this battle. And what I mean by that is that there was no formal military training. There was a call. If you have a musket, a good pair of shoes, and a canteen, you're good to go. There were light age limits, but most of the, the people, mostly cis men who fought were, teenagers into, not old agehood, but the life expectancy back then was a little shorter than it is now. So it was one of the main reasons people lost. There was no formal training against the British, who had been fighting for quite a while. So I have always been fascinated by sites where there's large scale reenactments of moments in history. My favorite subject, if you haven't noticed, throughout school was history. And I was fascinated not only as a performer, as a former actor, but what these moments would be like what would it be like? And people, and it is a ritual for many people. It is a ritual for many people to reenact this every year. And the performers, as you can see in the image on the screen, the performers to your left were the two high school teachers from upstate New York, and they do this every single year. And their research is impeccable. Like they had these costumes made. They do their research. Every little thing on their costume means something. What they're wearing, what the colors. And these two men were dressed more as I'm not going to say no wealthy men fought this battle, FYI. The people who fought this battle were poor, were farmers. And in that, you might have had peppered in some wealthier farmers or some, wealthier people, not rich, but just, ones who could afford, maybe some of the shirts and the vests that you're looking at. As opposed to me, I just had a white shirt on. It was most probably my sleep shirt. And, a simple pair of pants. And that costume was loaned to me by the folks at the Old Stone House. And I was fascinated, and through a series of conversations, the organizer said she is more than welcome to come. And we told them I was an artist and I was just interested in history and I wanted to participate. And they said, as long as she has a costume, she can come. I had a costume, and I chose the costume from the many that they had to be a militiaman. And throughout the day, I participated in the reenactment, and I was followed. I purposely, worked with a photographer to photograph me throughout the day. And it was very much, we played cinematographer and director. So we met and we had, eye contact indicators like, this is the photo you have to shoot kind of situation. And for me, this was a moment of seeing how I exist within the colonial history that I learned in the US. How do I fit in it? How do I fit in it knowing what I know from the future, right? What do I know from the future? At this time, it was 2017. What I know about the future is that there have been many moments of change for liberation in our country from a variety of different groups. And how does that play going back to the past? How do I walk every step of the way with this history that I'm carrying, in this history that I've been taught, where I'm not always seen as fitting into it, although I contribute fully to its existence by being born here, being a citizen. So this one is called Battle of Brooklyn, 3 reenactors and a visitor. And I'll just show you one more from that series. And this is, I learned how to shoot a musket from one of the reenactors, who's a Vietnam veteran. Michael is his name, and you see him on your right. And I needed to learn how to shoot a musket because I was going to be participating in the reenactment of the battle. And there was no gunpowder. It was just we just used the stuff that made it pop. Not the gunpowder itself, the pellets. Okay, I'm looking at the time, it's 10:34. Okay, so this led me to, and again, like I said, a lot of parts of my work that I'm sharing today, I'm peppering through different moments in my career with you, due to the time that we have, but just some of the more recent work. And this one I made right before lockdown, right before quarantine. And it's a short video where I become a United Nations official, but I embody that position through Jacqueline Khan McKean, who was the first child, 7-year-old child, who was killed at the border due to inadequate care. And I reimagine her addressing, at an older age, I reimagine her and embody her addressing the United Nations, asking for a different world with new solutions to the increasing violence occurring at our borders through the illegal detention of people fleeing catastrophic environmental changes, violence and extreme poverty caused by political and economic policies that are enacted by the G7 and G20 nations, so the wealthiest nations of the world. And my intention was to dare and radically imagine through her eyes, and in the tradition of artists, asking us to reimagine outside of the gallery walls and in full acknowledgement of why these gallery walls were constructed, of another possibility in our lives. And I wanted to play a quick portion of this for you. And I'm toggling through my screen. I might have to stop the share and reshare, but I'm going to see if this works. And it did. It worked.
Tres, dos, uno.
My name is Jacqueline Gal Makin, stepping in for global spokesperson Charlie Yaxley from the UN High Commission of Refugees. In light of the increasing violence enacted by the current government in the United States on its southern border, aimed not only at immigrants, but also at those who seek to help them, the 188 member countries have recommended enacting existing Security Council resolutions as follows: activating the deployment of United Nations peacekeeping operations to the U.S.-Mexican border, Security Council Resolution 1674 on the protection of civilians in armed conflict, Security Council Resolution 1612 on children in armed conflict, and Security Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security of the UN Charter in accordance to Chapter 8. UN peacekeepers have been mandated to play a catalytic role to protect and promote human rights. Peacekeepers will work on establishing refugee camps at the U.S. and Mexican border, providing food, shelter, and necessary medicinal attention, including trauma care. The aim is to protect families, women, children, and trans people who are at risk of wrongful imprisonment and to prevent the unnecessary death of people fleeing war and climactic devastation caused by settler colonial practices and capitalistic tactics aimed at extracting natural resources. Let's be clear, people don't leave their homes and walk miles on journeys that could be fatal. Nobody puts their lives or the lives of their families at risk. No one wants to leave home to go somewhere else. More so, recognizing the past peacekeeping missions have failed in due part for the professionalizing of the police state and thereby enacting and suppressing people and grassroots movements. Peacekeepers will not carry arms and will instead focus on healing, medicine, supplies, and food. The UN global leadership in New York has failed, and has failed to undertake the measures to operate in a time of climactic emergency and neo-fascism. As such, the 188 member nations have decided to enact a new resolution, 83073, which will transfer UN leadership to the indigenous and aboriginal peoples of countries comprising the 5 continents. Indigenous people must and will regain the right to define development, return to their ancestral homes, and eject corporations intent on destroying their life-giving forests. Lastly, the new resolution 83073 will disband permanent membership to the Security Council of all former colonizing countries, as well as those who have profited from the colonization and resource extracting economic endeavors. Changes at all levels will commence immediately. The persistent denial of the new reality under which modernity evolved led to the failed consequences of the League of Nations at the turn of the 20th century. Ideally, democracy is a system in which political power rests with the people. All citizens active in self-representation and self-governing, an ongoing process in which a multitude of diverse voices converge. We hope that this new resolution provides first steps to world unity in fighting neo-fascism, genocide, rape, war, and economic violence, as we prepare for climactic changes that will transform our lives on Earth forever.
Sorry, I'm gonna stop that share and go back. Here we are. Okay. And I will quickly go through this part of my talk. This is my most recent work, and there are a series of self-portraits I created during lockdown, and they're called from March to June. Okay, just making sure I'm still here. And I hope you all saw the video. If you don't see something, holler. Okay. These images, these self-portraits I created while in lockdown here in New York City. And they were created in my home. And these pictures are an oscillation between chronicling my life during the pandemic and embodied research on the inequality that BIPOC workers, poor essential workers have experienced during the pandemic. Each portrait's title includes the date I created it, as well as a hyperlink to an article associated to the essential work and issues depicted. These are conceptual characters. The hyperlinks are tools to take the viewer out of the myth making, which the mass media handles perfectly. They are meant to disrupt any sense of escapism through the art and go to the issue. I set up and shot these images myself, and in them mimics instances often found in photographs during that time of essential workers. They also are in full disclosure of me. I'm at home, and it's not the first project I do at home, but this one specifically, I was not attempting to do any set design changes to change it. It was like what my home looked like. And my home, in my home, I was not exclusive or exclusionary to what was occurring. The art isn't without the woman, the children, and the unevenness of life. So I'm going to take you right to, there was a short blog I was asked to write about this body of work at home with essential workers from March to June is the title of the series. And they, in total, there are another 18 images. They're about 5 by 6 feet, so they're very large. And I'll just read a quick first paragraph of a small op-ed I wrote for Verso Books. The first 2 months of the pandemic were filled with the sounds of ambulance sirens 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. At the beginning, I attempted to keep count of each siren I heard, but it simply got to be too many at a time, and I did not want to normalize any of it because the overall handling of the crisis had been abysmal. Another week in, I stopped looking at the time. COVID broke what was familiar for me. Who I felt close to fractured from anything recognizable for some time to come. Aside from immediate family living with me, the only other human beings I would see were essential workers. I began to measure time based on my interactions with them. Morning meant receiving the mail from the postal person. Afternoon came to mean seeing construction workers from outside my window, warily walking off of a scaffolding. I could tell from a distance they were sick. Every step was taken with extreme caution. If we were out of food, it meant a week had passed. I'd see the cashiers at the supermarket scared shitless. We'd look at each other not knowing anymore how to say hello or how are you. So these are some examples of some of these portraits. This one, it was taken in in December 3rd, 2020. And each title is the date and then the title of the article that I link to. And this particular article focused on domestic workers during that time. Many who just were not allowed to take any time for themselves as they were taking care of very wealthy families. And many of them who had gone elsewhere, left their homes, gone to a second or third home. This one was the very first one I did, March 31st. Rikers Island prisoners are being offered PPE and $6 an hour to dig mass graves. So in New York City, people who were imprisoned, many of whom in Rikers Island have not gotten a trial, many of whom have been arrested and put into Rikers Island without being convicted of anything. They were asked to dig the graves of the thousands of people who had died in hospitals. And I regarded them as an essential worker. September 6th, in the middle of the fires in California's wine country, undocumented grape pickers forced to work in fire evacuation zones and not provided, very few of them provided PPE or any medical attention if they felt ill. October 20th, this was in particular for our transit workers. Nearly 25% of New York City transit workers cited COVID-19 infections. And how many more do I have? Hold on. June 30th, hundreds occupy City Hall. Protesters demand the NYPD cut its budget by $1 billion. So there was a mass sit-in at City Hall here in New York City, where people were demanding a shift in the budget towards social and public programming, healthcare programming, rather than to the $1 billion allotted to the NYPD at the time. And this is another one I have. September 15th, 2020, lawyers allege abuse of migrant women by gynecologists in Georgia, where women were being sterilized without their knowledge. And many of these women become our essential workers, clean our homes, make our foods, take care of our children, take care of our elderly. I'm looking at the time, and I'm being aware that we might run out of time. In addition to this, to these portraits, I was also making videos, and in these videos, I reenacted a lot of the, texts that friends would send or posts that they would post of their lives during lockdown. And it was called 4 Aprils. And in it, I mix, I collage, and reenact or embody these statements within the context of my home. And I wanted to study what that storytelling process looked like between the collective and individual memories. At times, the components are inconclusive. Sometimes there is a disjunction between the soundtrack in this video and the image, or there's silence. And it's meant to highlight the fragmentary quality of reality, perspectives, and what is being experienced. The performances are based on interviews and conversations and posts that were shared with me from real people. And I stage them, I reenact them. And yet they're also the indexical truth that binds together all the other elements. There is an intention in mixing, because as I was making it, there was both a mixing and disconnect of space and time during quarantine. Zoom meetings, FaceTimes, memes, all these images created the spatial positioning specific to the events taking place. There were the elections, George Floyd protests, and COVID. I feel like I need to end here, right, Nicolas? Because it's 10:50, and I know you want to allow time for questions.
Yes, that is correct. Thank
Okay.
you. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. I'm going to stop the share. Okay.
Powerful images and narrative, and for talking about your work and what you do. And now we are going to open the floor for questions. And I know that walking and moving in the city has been central to your work. And you talk about colonized bodies who have dealt with empire. And so I think that I have many questions for you, but rather than actually ask my own question in terms of the body and the city or cities and walking, and how you navigate all of that through reenactments, through presentations, but also through being locked at home during the COVID pandemic. How does the body move through the city, physically, visually, spiritually? But I'll leave it at that and open the floor for students to ask questions. Questions? Mm-hmm.
Who or was there an audience for the Wendy Davis Texas Senate performance? So we see a picture of you, but was there an audience that was coming in and out of the space, or was it recorded and then presented to an online audience? I guess I'm just curious about what the audience was like for that piece.
Yeah, thanks for that question. We started at 9 a.m. and we were, what's 10? It's 11 hours. No, we started at 10, formally at 10 a.m. Those are nonprofit hours. And the doors were open. People came starting at 10 a.m. And until I was done. So 11 hours, 9 p.m. was when we finished. And it was just full of people at all times, and there were some slower times because some people came in the morning before going to work, got to work late, and then came back after work to see the conclusion of it. On BRIC TV, it was televised live, but yeah, people were coming in. Some people were there the whole time, including the curator, Elizabeth Ferrer. was there the entire time. She just, she was just down there. And a lot of the BRIC staff members were as well, and some audience members. There was a good 2 handfuls of them that were there the entire 11 hours. They were just, some people I didn't know, and they provided such moral support, but it was a live event with audience members. And at the end of the night, it was pretty much of a packed house.
And BRIC is in Brooklyn. Yeah, it's an art space in Brooklyn. Any questions from
I'm kind of curious to know whether or not there's like ever a hope that like when you were doing a reenactment of someone who is like actively, someone who's like alive and like in the political sphere or whatever it is actively, do you ever hope that those people like see your works and see the way that you're like, I guess, digesting what it is that they do?
Thank you for that question. My work is, it's not necessarily for the quote unquote art world. My work is for the people that I'm either trying to embody, or the communities that they're from, for anyone who's open enough to listen to a different perspective, or to just step in further into a reality that they're experiencing in a deeper moment. A lot of my work is a witnessing, is to say, here, you have a witness. I am your witness.
anybody?
I'm gonna ask, do you have a daily practice or a weekly practice, or like something habitual that helps you come up with ideas for your work? A lot of the students in our class are, this is the intro to performance art. I guess if you have any suggestions or anything maybe you can share about how you come up with ideas.
Yeah, this is the less romantic, glamorized side of being an artist. Sometimes there's a lot of administrative work. I don't have a studio assistant, so sometimes I spend a lot of time behind a computer writing proposals or drafting thoughts. So a lot of it, aside from the administrative part, becomes very conceptual. And I really like working with my hands. I'm a phase in photography, and I went at a time where we were in a dark room. So for me, the continual inspiration and like practice, a lot of it entails, there's a lot of reading, there's a lot of note taking, there's a lot of watching and observing, there's a lot of journal writing. And I mentioned before that I was a theater major, and for many reasons, I part of me forced any of that training, forced it to the side, but I've been slowly coming back to more, if you're familiar with more body practices and with more intentional body work. And I've been segueing towards that, since 2020. And that's what it looks like. I don't mean to be vague, but a lot of it for me is organic. I'm not a painter who sketches. I with my body, it's a lot with acknowledging what resonates with me, listening to my body, in a different way. We're often in our thoughts, our minds are like chatter, 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 chatter. But quieting down that chatter and listening to, some may call it listen to what spirit tells you. Listen to your intuition, to when you're reading something, and then I'll analyze, this particular moment, for example, with the essential workers, it was God. Not only is the moment of being locked down, not, going outside, and it could be a complete death sentence at that time. Listening to how my body was reacting to my surroundings, and then paying close attention to other people, the few people that I saw, going into a journal writing process, lots of tears, and then contrasting that to what I was reading and what I was seeing, and who was doing that writing and who was doing that broadcasting, the differences between them. And then from there, paying close attention to each of the individual characters, if you will, that I decided to embody, and making those choices. That's kind of how my practice goes day to day. I'm not a dancer with that vigorous, dancing movement. So it's somewhere in between. But for the most part, it's just getting out of our heads and listening to what our hearts tell us, what our guts tell us, or tell me. I'll use I statements, friends. What my heart and my gut is telling me, and then following that through with more analysis, just to balance the mind and heart.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
One last question before we close this wonderful presentation. I know that you have done work with walking, and as I said before, your body is central to the different narratives that you are writing, rewriting, embodying, inhabiting, and re-inhabiting. Can you talk briefly about walk and walking in the city in relationship to your work and to your life?
And I didn't share any of my walking performances, but I have visited Austin, and it's a lovely city, and I'm trying to see what aspects of it can I compare to New York City. But assuming that some of you have been to New York City, or if you've walked around Austin when it's really, really busy, there are a lot of different energies coming all the time. And how to be mindful of all those energies. When we just pass a corner, we're interacting some way with each other, even if it's silent, and even if one person is just in their world, in their bubble. The New York City that I know, that I grew up in, is actually a really friendly place. People know who's there. People know who's on the block. People see you. And we're growing up in New York City, it's not a car culture. You have to be with other people, whether you like it or not. Either it's on a bus or on a subway or on a crowded street. There's no escaping in a car, driving in your own bubble somewhere. And there's no shade. I'm driving in a car, being in your bubble. Sometimes we need that, friends. We need to be in our own bubble, driving in a car somewhere. But what I mean to say is that it's not an option in New York for many different reasons. So relating to people daily, for various hours, it could be for just a moment that you do, but you are with other people. There's no doubt that you share the world with different people who may not have the same experiences or life perspectives as you, or who may, but we share the space. We have to share the space, and we all want to do that in a good way and get home safely to our friends and family in a good mood. So a lot of my walking, some of the walking performances that I've done have to do with what happens in these interactions when someone needs help. How do we react when someone needs help? What does that look like? And it's a particular series that's called The Rule is Love. And how do we act from a place where it's selfless, where we're acting from that place of love? And love, I'm not talking in any romantic sense, you know, love, the Greeks have 9 definitions for love. You know, I think the Hopi have 123 definitions of love. But if we were to summarize these definitions, it's just acting from a good place, a selfless place, where all we want is for other people to live fully and well. And my walking pieces address that idea. How do we ensure that another person is living fully and well? And it's obviously a benefit for them, but you know, it does come back to us. It's a dance that you can't dance alone. So these walking experiences are based on my experiences of growing up in a very, very busy place where I have to share space with other people in different circumstances from different walks of life all the time. And that has made me relate to the world around me in a very unique way, where I don't think, and I don't know because I haven't lived through that experience, so I'm assuming, I don't think it would have been possible for me if I had lived in a different situation where I didn't have to be around other people all the time, where I could only be around those I chose to be around.
Thank you so much for today. I hope to see you in person, and I hope that you have a good day.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day. And thank you so much. Oh, you're so welcome. You're really lucky to have Nicolas. All right, y'all. Have a good
Much
time.
love. Take care.
All right, bye.
Bye.